You probably know the story of LVO 2018, the rules lawyer who lived by the pedantic sword and died by the pedantic sword. But here's the thing. That wasn't the first time competitive Warhammer broke its own rules and had to look in the mirror. It wasn't even the second. Competitive 40K has a recurring structural feature that doesn't get named clearly enough. Someone finds the gap between what the rules say and what the game actually intends. They exploit it at a major event. The result lands in a way the community knows is wrong, technically legal, factually correct, and somehow still a betrayal of the competitive premise. The circuit ruptures, publicly, often on stream. Then it patches itself. It writes one more norm, one more mechanism, one more formally codified rule that didn't exist before. The current state of competitive 40K, its code of conduct, its yellow card penalties, its ITC now integrated directly with Games Workshop, is the accumulated product of every time the community was forced to answer a question it had previously left vague. Every crisis left something behind, and the people who triggered each crisis are, in a backwards way, the architects of the structure they were trying to subvert. To understand how competitive 40K ends up where you start not in Las Vegas in 2018, but in a forum called Daka in 2007. Warhammer 40,000 first hit tables in 1987. Competitive tournament play grew organically through independent grand tournaments, with Games Workshop running official events in the early editions and individual tournament organizers writing supplementary rulings to fill every gap GW left behind. There was no unified standard, no shared FAQ governing more than one event, no appeals process that meant anything beyond the specific weekend you were attending. Rules disputes were handled per event, and the competitive circuit operated on the understanding that each TO's interpretation was locally sovereign. By 2007, that had become genuinely untenable. GW's FAQ and errata output was inconsistent at best, and the tournament scene had expanded beyond what a gentleman's agreement culture could hold together. A group of players from Daka built the INAT, the Independent National Warhammer 40K Tournament FAQ. Entirely unofficial, built from scratch, covering every known unresolved rules issue in 5th edition, with each decision flagged to show whether it followed strict rules as written, made a judgment call where raw was ambiguous, or reversed an official GW FAQ outright. From the document's own introduction, it existed to give players advanced knowledge of how tournament judges will be ruling the myriad of tricky situations that arise in games of 40K. The INAT ran through multiple versions. Version 5.1.1 released April 12, 2012. Then, 6th edition launched properly, and the INAT went on hiatus, updating a comprehensive, unofficial ruling framework for an entirely new rules system was an enormous undertaking, and nobody involved was being paid to do it. The gap it left was real. Frontline Gaming stepped into that gap. Reese Robbins built the independent tournament circuit to provide a unified competitive framework across the United States. By 2015, he was publishing how ITC policy decisions were made, why community polls drove rule changes, and what the decision-making process looked like from inside. By January 2016, Captain A, writing for Frontline Gaming, described the ITC as one of the best things to happen to tournament gaming since the Swiss format. That year, the circuit was influencing events outside the US, and the Las Vegas Open had grown into the largest singles 40K event on the circuit. The ITC wasn't built because competitive 40K was working fine. It was built because competitive 40,000 had been tearing open at the same seam for years, and the accumulated frustration finally produced something institutional. Both the INAT and the ITC were direct responses to the same underlying problem: rules gaps that players exploited, and no central authority with the scope to close them in real time. Everything that follows sits on that foundation. January 2018, Las Vegas. The LVO 40K Championship is underway. The FLG Twitch cameras are running near the front of the gaming hall. Over 1,000 people are watching from home. The meta in January 2018 is severely distorted. The Inari, Eldar unified under the death god Ennead, have a faction ability called Soul Burst. When any unit dies nearby, any infantry or biker unit within 7 inches can perform an additional action. In a game built around activating units in structured phases, firing back during your opponent's turn or moving again after a casualty triggers is categorically broken in the right hands. Bell of Lost Souls would write post-event that the Inari are kings of the meta and no one knows how to stop them. Tony Grippando is running an Alatok/Inari list. His quarterfinal opponent is Alexander Fennel, an experienced competitor running an Imperial list anchored around Space Wolves and Guard, assault characters built to close distance and mitigate opponent shooting. Both players know each other outside this game. Before the game, both players agree to play by intent. This is standard at the competitive level. Ambiguous situations get resolved by what each player is clearly trying to accomplish, not strict letter-of-the-law enforcement. It reduces friction. It acknowledges that 40K's rule set is complex enough that misreading the order of an action is easy, and penalizing honest mistakes as strategic deceptions poisons the game. The agreement is made openly. Tony's deployment and first turn takes approximately 1 hour. The total game allocation is 2.5 hours. When Tony finishes his first turn, less than 60 minutes remain for all remaining turns combined. The clock is now an active pressure on Alex's play, visible to everyone in the venue and on stream. When Alex begins his turn, he's moving quickly. He makes an order of operations mistake mid-phase, placing a unit at the wrong point in the sequence. His intent is obvious to everyone watching. He's trying to move efficiently under time pressure. He acknowledges the mistake immediately when it's pointed out. He doesn't contest it. Tony enforces it, strictly. The pre-game agreement to play by intent is set aside. Jeff In Control Robinson's editorial on Frontline Gaming, published February 1st, described what happened. Tony helped Alex measure the move, then pointed out the phase had already ended. The result was that Alex wasn't able to perform any further movement with the entirety of his force. An assault army, designed around closing distance, couldn't move. The game was functionally over. Alex briefly considered conceding, then decided to play it out for the stream. Tony won and advanced to the championship finals. Here the story requires honest engagement with the position Tony was defending. Tony Grippando wasn't wrong to know the rules. At a $4,000 prize event, the argument for bright-line rules enforcement has genuine force. A judge who doesn't know either player's relationship, preparation, or history has no neutral way to determine what someone obviously intended. If lenient enforcement becomes the default expectation, players who prepared the order of operations precisely, who practiced the edge cases, who built their list assuming opponents would be held to the letter of the rules, are disadvantaged against players whose errors get excused. Pre-game agreements to play by intent are informal and unenforceable at the structural level. Either player technically retains the right to revert to rules as written. Salty John's judge write-up from January 31st grappled with exactly this. Formalizing sportsmanship rules creates its own gaming incentive, but leaving them informal means enforcement is personality-dependent in a venue where personality shouldn't determine outcomes. The problem at LVO 2018 wasn't that Tony knew the rules. The problem was selective application, activated specifically after agreeing not to against a teammate, after consuming an hour of their shared game time in his own deployment. Selective, strict enforcement has a specific structural failure that consistent intent-based play doesn't share. It lets a player benefit from leniency on their own errors while weaponizing the rulebook against their opponents. The rules weren't the problem. How they were deployed was. In the championship finals, Tony faces Nick Nanavati. Nanavati is playing his own Space Elves army. Nanavati applies the same strict enforcement posture against Tony that Tony had used a round earlier. Reddit threads that evening title themselves Tony Getting Tonied. Within hours, to Tony someone is in circulation as a verb, meaning discover that the pedantic sword cuts both ways. Nick wins. He takes the ITC championship, the LVO 40,000 title, and $4,000. The community's documented consensus in the months after LVO 2018 noted that Tony's competitive approach changed substantially. He became less aggressive in his rules posture. Nanavati, by multiple public accounts, said Tony had genuinely taken the lesson to heart. The community didn't erase the incident. It cataloged it, named a behavior pattern after it, and watched what followed. FLG head judge Salty John's January 31st write-up flagged sportsmanship problems as requiring real solutions, not just community disapproval. He raised the yellow and red card model used in European soccer, formal conduct penalties with real in-game consequences, while acknowledging the counter-problem. Formalize the penalties, and players will optimize around the penalty structure. He was right. Both things happened. Within weeks, Resius confirmed in the comments of Robinson's February 1st editorial that Frontline Gaming was actively drafting judging guidelines for more uniformity. The community's informal term for what Tony did, angle shooting, would eventually become a formally defined category in the ITC Code of Conduct. Not immediately. More incidents forced the issue first. LVO 2018 is the incident with the video. The structural pattern runs back through editions that had no streams, no real-time Reddit threads, and no community podcasts dissecting results within 24 hours. 7th edition released May 24, 2014. It brought a dedicated psychic phase transplanted from Warhammer Fantasy, introduced demon summoning as a competitive mechanic, and launched with the Eldar Codex in a configuration that would define competitive problems for 2 years. Within 5 months, Frontline Gaming called the invisibility psychic power from the telepathy discipline, arguably the most powerful psychic power in the game of 40K. A community blog in March 2016, still during 7th edition's competitive life, reinforced. Invisibility got a huge boost from 6th to 7th edition. The mechanical effect made certain units near unkillable. Units under invisibility suffered severe penalties to hit in both shooting and assault. Pairing the power with a durable platform created table anchors that most lists couldn't answer efficiently without specifically building around the counter. And the Eldar Codex had enough additional tools, including jet bikes equipped with scatter lasers on every single model in the unit, to make that counter building itself a trap. Demon summoning compounded the problem from a different direction. The psychic phase introduced in 7th let armies add units mid-game using warp charges without paying their points costs in the original list construction. Community discussion from the period was direct. Summoning just does not work in a tournament environment. You couldn't fully prepare for a force that expanded after setup. The ITC applied restrictions on demon summoning through community polling before GW addressed it officially, because the competitive circuit couldn't wait for a publisher running on a design cycle measured in years. The official response came in May 2016, a GWFAQ megathread addressing invisibility interactions, wall of death mechanics, and a substantial list of 7th edition edge cases. Approximately 2 years after the problems became undeniable, the 7th edition retrospective record describes the big rulebook FAQ as addressing numerous exploits, including Battle Brothers deploying in transports, blocking enemy movement with open drop pod doors, and other loopholes. The list was long. Those loopholes had existed and been actively exploited for the duration of the edition. That 2-year lag between a clearly broken mechanic and an official response is what forced the ITC to develop fast response tools. Community polls as a first response mechanism. Restrictions applied through circuit consensus rather than official rules. Frontline Gaming willing to say in writing that a particular interaction was banned from ITC events before GW had addressed it. None of that infrastructure existed in vacuum. 7th edition's broken stretches built it. 8th edition launched June 17, 2017. The core rules reset was genuine, and the initial community response was positive. Simpler interactions, cleaner phases, a fresh start. The detachment system for matched play required all units to share at least one faction keyword. In practice, the Imperium keyword covered Space Marines, Astra Militarum, Assassins, Sisters of Battle, and a range of other sub-factions. The strongest individual units from across those codices were technically eligible for the same detachment structure. Top competitive lists spent most of 8th edition combining the best units from multiple Imperial factions into configurations that no individual codex had been designed to oppose. The resulting armies weren't balanced against by any single codex balance pass. They were assembled from the intersection of several, none of which had been tested against the product as assembled. Frontline Gaming's FAQ highlights piece in April 2018 captured the competitive community's frustration. It's nice that a psychic power or two were upped in cost, or a stratagem limited or made more expensive. But why stop there? Incremental patches against a structural problem produced incremental relief. The underlying incentive, pull the strongest available units from across the entire Imperium into one army, remained intact until GW addressed keyword restrictions more directly in subsequent FAQ passes. The cleanest documented case of the full exploit to emergency FAQ pipeline in modern competitive 40K comes from 2022. The Leagues of Votann, GW's return of the Squats as a playable faction, released with unit profiles that hadn't been adequately stress-tested against competitive play at high levels. Tournament results from the first events were lopsided in a direction that wasn't ambiguous. The community backlash was specific and immediate. GW issued tournament-driven FAQ nerfs after that feedback, on a timeline fast enough that Spiky Bits published a piece noting GW was explicitly owning their mistake. Release, exploitation at events, community backlash, emergency FAQ, public GW acknowledgement, completed in weeks rather than 2 years. The difference in timelines between 7th edition's invisibility lag and Votann's rapid response FAQ reflects how much the ITC's direct communication pathway to GW's rules team had matured. Every painful year of the 7th edition meta, every community poll, every ITC restriction, every forum thread documenting what was broken, contributed to building the relationship between competitive organizers and Games Workshop that made faster responses possible in later editions. The ITC's fast response tools weren't designed in the abstract. They were built because the alternative was watching the same problems metastasize for 2 years at a time. Magic the Gathering has faced the same structural tension across its entire competitive history. The rules as written versus rules as intended gap exists in any game complex enough to have real ambiguities. The MTG community has a catalog of incidents where a strict reading of a card interaction violates the obvious intent of the game design. MTG's competitive governance addressed this decades ago with the Infraction Procedure Guide, a formal document assigning specific graduated consequences to specific categories of violation, with defined triggers that remove judge subjectivity on the most common infractions. Players know the consequence structure before sitting down. Competitive 40K is still building its version of that document. The ITC Code of Conduct, as of its 2021 overhaul, is the closest thing the circuit has, and the gap between the two reflects exactly how far the community still has to go. Most of what breaks in competitive 40K breaks on the table. Mechanics, timing, unit interactions. By 2021, the ITC had been operating long enough for players to identify a different category of exploit, one that didn't require clever rules interactions at all. It required showing up more often than your competition. A Reddit thread from September 2021 broke down specific data from the ITC ranking system. The numbers were precise. Out of 600 players sampled, 94 had accumulated more than 200 ITC points. The significance was that 200 points exceeded the yield from winning many grand tournaments outright. 55 players had topped 220 points. The ranking system, designed to identify the best competitive 40K players in the United States, was generating scores where volume event attendance, traveling frequently, consistently finishing mid-table at a high number of events, could mathematically exceed the ranking impact of winning at a high level. The steel man for this is familiar from any competitive ranking argument. Attending more events demonstrates genuine commitment to the circuit. Players who compete more accumulate experience, correct mistakes faster, and develop the repetition-based game knowledge that separates good players from great ones. If you want a top ranking, invest the time and the entry fees. The point where that argument collapses is when 55 players are outranking tournament champions through attendance patterns rather than results. When the ranking system is measuring something other than competitive excellence, when it's measuring, in a narrow but real sense, travel budget and event access, the system is no longer doing what it was built to do. The mechanism produces a perverse incentive: maximize event volume rather than targeting fewer, higher stakes GTs, and the ranking math potentially works in your favor without ever winning a premier event. Intentional low scoring appeared as a related exploit in August 2021. A specific incident at a competitive event prompted a TO to publicly ask the community how deliberately tight victory margins, winning close enough to manipulate Swiss pairings and avoid strong opponents in later rounds, should be treated. Swiss pairings match players with similar records. A player with an inflated record of narrow wins could spend later rounds facing softer opposition, while a player with the same win count but larger margins faced the bracket's strongest remaining competitors. Legal under the rules. A calculated exploitation of how the system pairs opponents. The TO's post framed it directly. I would like to address the slight controversy that happened this weekend and also get the community's thoughts on how it should be treated/resolved. The Birmingham Supermajor in May 2022 made the pairings problem visible at a named major event. A Reddit thread from that weekend was explicit. The competitive integrity of events and the ITC system as a whole needs to be questioned if events are using Swiss pairings in a way that is subject to gaming. That framing implies something had already happened. The post wasn't a theoretical concern. Frontline Gaming acknowledged the problem formally in December 2022. The title of the piece was its own acknowledgement. Does Tournament 40K need an incentive not to game the system? The organization that built the circuit was publicly asking whether the circuit's own infrastructure had generated wrong incentives. That question doesn't appear in a vacuum. It appears after enough documented incidents that denying the pattern is no longer credible. The structural response to scoring exploitation came partly through algorithm adjustments and more sharply through the June 2021 Code of Conduct overhaul. Salty John's write-up on the changes was specific about the problem being addressed. The yellow card system itself had been gamed. A yellow card for submitting your list late was, for some players, a rational, budgeted cost. You had 2 more yellows before a red and disqualification. The updated code made yellow cards immediately costly. A yellow card now attached a -20 victory point penalty to the offending player's first round game. The accumulation threshold dropped from 3 yellows for a red to 2. You couldn't budget your penalties anymore because the first one damaged your event before you could assess whether absorbing it was strategically worth it. A small but significant addition in the same update addressed the clock directly. Community documentation of ITC competitive behavior had identified a specific exploit. Only judges were authorized to pause the game clock, which meant requesting a judge call on a minor question, or encouraging an opponent to look up rules, could be used to run time from their allocation. The Nova Open 2022 tournament packet named the behavior explicitly as stalling and defined it as a cheat. If it's determined that you used a clock or our time policy to intentionally slow play, game the clock, or otherwise abuse the rules for unfair advantage, the appropriate infraction would be stalling. The explicit language in a Premier Events tournament packet existed because enough incidents had occurred that the behavior needed a name and a formal consequence. The naming itself was the progress. The same June 2021 Code of Conduct update introduced angle shooting as a formalized violation category. Salty John's documentation of the change described it as filling a gap judges had experienced without language to address, situations where a player's behavior was rules legal but clearly outside the spirit of competitive play, leaving judges without a specific category to invoke. The term's introduction into an official document with enforcement weight is the formal codification of what the LVO 2018 community had been circulating in Reddit threads for 3 years under the informal name Getting Tonied. Systems produce pressure. Individuals make it undeniable. April 2021, the Fabricator Forge Grand Tournament. An attendee is filmed violating rules during a game, not accused by an opponent with a disputed interpretation, captured on camera during active play. Frontline Gaming published a formal notice of ITC administrative action. The penalty? A 1-year ban from ITC points accumulation during the 2021 season. The community response revealed the enforcement structure's vulnerabilities in real time. Multiple observers argued the 1-year ban was insufficient, given what had been documented. The player's relationship with FLG complicated the optics. One community member's comment was direct. "This is a really bad look for you guys, considering the relationship the guilty party has with FLG." Frontline Gaming published their reasoning. The debate continued for weeks. YouTube coverage generated sustained community engagement across both the initial announcement and the player's public statement. What the Fabricator Forge incident forced into the open was a question the community had never formally answered. What enforcement mechanisms exist at the circuit level? Who controls them? And what happens when the enforcer has a prior relationship with the accused? The ITC Code of Conduct was substantially overhauled 2 months later. The yellow card changes, the angle shooting definition, a new section on team and club conduct added for the first time, all arrived in June 2021, 2 months after an incident that made the gaps in the existing code impossible to ignore. The Lone Star Open, across 2 separate years, documents a different vulnerability. In 2023, a player attending the Lone Star Open was banned from circuit events for 1 year. The documented violations were systematic, misplaying army rules, applying different unit stats than published datasheets specified, running different war gear configurations between matches at the same event. Identifying this pattern required sustained attention across multiple rounds. It wasn't a disputed interpretation of an ambiguous rule. It was persistent manipulation of the game state, documented across multiple opponents over the course of a single event weekend. The player had prior competitive history, a previous ban from the Texas competitive circuit, with that ban having been lifted approximately 3 years before the Lone Star incident. In 2025, the same player returned to competitive events. The same behavior resumed at the Lone Star Open 2025 and other events. A second ban followed, this time indefinite, from the TCC. What the 2 ban arc documents is the governance gap no single organization can fully close. A ban from one circuit doesn't automatically propagate to every TO in the country. There's no universal registry, no shared database that every event checks before registration opens. The recurring offender didn't exploit a game mechanic. They exploited the space between what different organizations knew and what they were each willing to enforce independently. Each ban was a structural response. The structural response's limit was its jurisdiction. Salty John's March 2022 editorial. Stop it. Get some help. Written after head judging LVO for the 3rd year running, addressed the full range of behaviors accumulating in his observation with directness. You are going to get caught at some point. It's going to happen. And the tournament organizers of 40K, Age of Sigmar, Kill Team, etc. aren't taking this stuff lying down anymore. You're going to catch a ban from the event. You are going to become a pariah in the hobby. You will be dragged online. You will lose credibility. And you might even earn yourself a year's ban from the ITC itself. That confidence in enforcement was new. It wasn't a posture Salty John could have credibly taken in 2014. The enforcement infrastructure behind it had been built incident by incident across every year since the INAT's creation in 2007. Goonhammer put the underlying structural critique plainly in their analysis of misplay and cheating in competitive 40,000. Our entire approach to misplay, cheating, and penalization places the emphasis on the wrong subject and fails to facilitate active judging. The wrong subject being the individual incident rather than the systems that make individual behavior legible, enforceable, and consequential across every event in the circuit. The critique is accurate. What's also true is that every individual incident produced one more piece of the system the critique says was missing. The 7th edition invisibility problem ran for 2 years because the ITC didn't yet have a direct line to GW's rules team. Leagues of Votan's problems resolved in weeks because that line existed by 2022. LVO 2018 generated a Reddit verb and a community-wide sportsmanship debate that Salty John was watching from the judge table. 3 years later, the behavior that generated that debate had a formal name in an official document with attached VP penalties. The Fabricator Forge filmed cheating incident forced a public reckoning with enforcement authority and organizational conflicts of interest. The Code of Conduct rewrote itself 2 months later. The Lone Star Open's 2-ban arc is documenting the jurisdiction gap the circuit still hasn't fully closed, which means the structural response for that gap is still coming. By 2025, the ITC is no longer an independent player-organized circuit operating at arm's length from Games Workshop. The 2025 restructuring came after direct GW consultation with independent organizers, Best Coast pairings, and focus groups. Country-level rankings replaced the old US-centric structure. Scoring algorithms were adjusted to better weight event quality over volume attendance, a direct structural response to the 2021 anomaly where 94 players accumulated more than 200 ITC points without winning premier events. Automated token approval rolled out for certified tournament organizers who have demonstrated track records. GW email addresses are now embedded in ITC event infrastructure. The Warhammer community official announcement confirmed LVO will remain one of the most important events in the competitive calendar. That sentence, appearing on GW's own website, would have been remarkable in 2014. It wasn't remarkable in 2025 because the relationship had been built slowly. Over every year, the community forced structural improvements that Games Workshop eventually had to take seriously. Reese Robbins and the DACA Ruling Council, and every TO who drafted a tournament packet with an explicit stalling definition, none of them started with the goal of building a quasi-regulatory body for competitive Warhammer. They started by trying to fix the specific problem in front of them. The INAT tried to fix GW's inadequate errata output. The ITC tried to fix the lack of a unified competitive standard. The yellow card revisions tried to fix the penalty structure being gamed. The angle shooting definition tried to fix the gap between what rules permitted and what competitive play was supposed to reward. The country-level ranking algorithm tried to fix the perverse incentive that volume attendance had created. None of those fixes were designed into the system at launch. All of them arrived after something went wrong publicly enough that leaving the gap vague was no longer an option. The rules lawyers and the exploit runners and the players who drove trucks through gaps in the rulebook didn't mean to build anything. They were trying to win games. But in doing so, they kept forcing the community to answer questions it had been comfortable leaving vague. What does the rules as written standard actually require at a cash prize event? Who enforces it when the enforcer has a prior relationship with the accused? What happens when the scoring system itself becomes the exploit? And how do you close the distance between what the rules technically permit and what competitive play is supposed to produce? Those answers are written down now, more of them every year. The current state of competitive 40K, with its formal code of conduct, its angle shooting definition, its yellow card consequences tied to immediate VP penalties, its GW integrated circuit with country-level rankings, its faster FAQ pipeline from tournament result to rules correction, is made of those answers, stacked one crisis at a time. The pedantic sword cut both ways at LVO 2018. It had been cutting both ways long before that, in editions with no streams and no comment sections. Every time a gap in the rules produced a result the community couldn't accept and a response the community had to invent because Games Workshop hadn't provided one. And it will cut again. The next exploit will find the next gap. The community will rupture, then patch, then write one more thing down that wasn't written before. That's what the scar tissue is made of. Subscribe for more stories like this.